When I finally heard my daughter-in-law describe my kitchen as the heart of her future, I realized something unsettling. She had already started planning a life in my home, and she never once asked who had been paying for it all along. I remember the exact morning because it began like every other morning had since my husband passed away 3 years earlier. The house was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into old walls and reminds you that someone important is missing. I stood in my kitchen just after 7 o'clock, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its familiar gurgling cycle. Sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows above the sink, casting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. For 32 years, this kitchen had been the center of our family. My husband, Robert, had insisted on building the oversized island himself. He spent 2 weekends measuring, cutting, sanding, and staining every piece until it was perfect. Even now, if I ran my fingers across the edge, I could still find the tiny imperfection he used to joke about whenever guests complimented his work. I poured my coffee into the blue ceramic mug he had bought me during a road trip through Vermont nearly 20 years ago and sat at the small breakfast table by the window. Outside, the maple trees swayed gently in the early spring breeze. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it always had. And yet, something felt different. My son Ethan and his wife Vanessa had moved into the house 6 months earlier. At first, it had seemed like a practical arrangement. Ethan's company was relocating offices. Their apartment lease had ended. The housing market was unpredictable. They insisted it would only be temporary. Just until we figure things out, Mom, Ethan had said. I had welcomed them without hesitation. Family helped family. That was how I had always been raised. But over time, little things began changing. Vanessa started reorganizing cabinets without asking. Decorative pieces disappeared from shelves. Family photographs were moved to less visible places. My favorite armchair somehow ended up in the corner of the den while a new sectional sofa appeared front and center. None of it was dramatic enough to argue about. None of it seemed worth creating tension. So I stayed quiet. That morning, as I carried my coffee toward the hallway, I noticed voices coming from the dining room. Vanessa was speaking excitedly. Curious, I slowed my steps. Through the partially open doorway, I saw large sheets of paper spread across the dining table. Color samples. Floor plans. Fabric swatches. Design sketches. Vanessa stood over them with the enthusiasm of someone planning a dream vacation. The kitchen is the first thing, she said. Once we open this wall and replace those cabinets, the whole house will finally feel modern. Ethan laughed softly. You've really thought this through. Of course I have, Vanessa replied. This is where we're building our future. My grip tightened around the coffee mug. This is where we're building our future. The words echoed in my mind. Not a future. Their future. In my house. I remained still, listening. And the nursery could go where Helen's sewing room is now, Vanessa continued. It gets the best natural light. There was a brief silence. Then Ethan said, maybe. We'll figure that out later. My sewing room. The room where I kept decades of memories, projects, letters, and photographs. They were discussing it as if it were an empty storage closet waiting to be reassigned. I quietly stepped away before either of them noticed me. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was stranger than anger. It was the realization that while I had been trying to make them comfortable, they had already started imagining a version of this house that no longer included me at the center of it. I walked back into the kitchen and stared out the window again. The maple trees still swayed. Birds still hopped across the lawn. The world outside remained unchanged. But inside these walls, something had shifted. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I had never considered before. If Vanessa was making plans for every room in this house, how much did she actually know about the house itself? Because hidden in a place she had never bothered to look was a truth that would change everything. And soon enough, that truth would force all of us to confront who this home really belonged to. For the rest of that day, I said nothing about what I had overheard. I made lunch. I watered the flowers on the back patio. I folded a basket of laundry and placed it neatly in my room. On the surface, everything looked normal. But once you notice a crack in a window, you cannot stop seeing it. Every conversation sounded different. Every decision felt heavier. That evening, the three of us sat down for dinner at the same oak table where Ethan had done his homework as a boy and where Robert and I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and countless Sunday meals. Vanessa talked enthusiastically about paint colors. Ethan listened while scrolling through emails on his phone. I quietly passed the salad bowl and focused on my plate. I think lighter cabinets would make the kitchen feel twice as big, Vanessa said. And honestly, some of the older features are starting to look dated. I felt her glance toward me for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be rude. Just long enough to make her point. People like open spaces now. Ethan nodded. Maybe. Vanessa smiled. Trust me. Once everything is updated, the value of the house will increase dramatically. The value of the house. The phrase lingered in my mind. During the 32 years Robert and I lived there together, we rarely talked about value. We talked about memories. We talked about family. We talked about whether the grandchildren would one day run through the same hallways their father had. Somewhere along the way, the language had changed. The house had become an asset instead of a home. Over the following weeks, the changes continued. Small things. Easy to dismiss if viewed one at a time. My collection of antique cookbooks disappeared from the kitchen shelf and reappeared in a box in the basement. Family photographs were replaced by framed abstract artwork Vanessa purchased online. A handmade quilt my mother had sewn decades ago vanished from the guest room bed. When I finally found it folded inside a closet, Vanessa smiled and said, "I was just trying to freshen things up." Freshen things up. That became her favorite phrase. One Saturday morning, I walked into the garage and discovered several cardboard boxes stacked beside the door. Written across the top in black marker were the words "Donate." Curious, I lifted the lid from one of them. Inside were holiday decorations, old family keepsakes, and several items that belonged to Robert. My chest tightened. I picked up a small wooden toolbox he had used for years. The handle was worn smooth from his hands. "Oh, I meant to tell you about those," Vanessa said from behind me. I turned around. She was holding an iced coffee and looking completely relaxed. "Most of it is just taking up space." I carefully placed the toolbox back into the box. "Some of these things belong to Robert." "I know," she replied. "But you cannot keep everything forever." Her tone was polite. Calm. Reasonable. That somehow made it worse. Because there was no obvious cruelty to confront. Just a steady assumption that she had the authority to decide what stayed and what went. That night, I sat alone in my sewing room. The room she had already imagined turning into something else. Around me were shelves filled with fabrics, photo albums, and projects collected over decades. I looked at the walls and tried to picture them empty. The thought left me uneasy. Then my eyes drifted toward the built-in cabinet near the far corner of the room. It had been there since Robert remodeled the space years earlier. Most people thought it was ordinary storage. In reality, it contained something very few people knew existed. I had not opened it in nearly 3 years. Not since the week after Robert's funeral. Slowly, I stood and walked across the room. My hand rested on the brass handle for several seconds before I pulled it open. And what I saw inside immediately brought back a conversation Robert and I had shared shortly before he died. Inside the cabinet sat a simple black document box covered with a thin layer of dust. I stared at it for a long moment before lifting it onto the work table. The last time I had touched it was shortly after Robert's funeral, when grief had made even the smallest decisions feel impossible. My fingers traced the edges of the box as memories surfaced. Robert had always been a planner. Not because he expected trouble, but because he believed responsibility meant preparing for things other people overlooked. About 6 months before his passing, we had spent a quiet evening on the back porch watching the sunset. I remembered the way he folded his hands and looked out across the yard before speaking. "Helen," he had said, "if anything ever happens to me, promise you will not let anyone pressure you into making quick decisions." At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. He smiled. "Maybe. But families change when money and property become involved. Good people stay good. Other people show sides of themselves you never expected." Back then, I could not imagine Ethan becoming distant or anyone treating this home as anything other than the place where our family gathered. Yet now, sitting in the sewing room, his words felt less like caution and more like a prediction. I opened the box. Inside were neatly organized folders, trust documents, tax records, insurance papers, and several sealed envelopes with Robert's handwriting on them. One envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, in careful blue ink, were the words, "For Helen. Only if circumstances change." My heart tightened. Slowly, I opened it. The letter inside was only 2 pages long. Robert's handwriting was unmistakable. He explained that he had structured certain assets differently than most people assumed. He wanted to make sure I would always have security and control regardless of future circumstances. He also wrote something that made me read the paragraph twice. The house itself was connected to a larger financial arrangement managed through a family trust. Not because he expected conflict, but because he wanted long-term protection for me and for future generations. I sat back in my chair. Over the years, I had signed documents and attended meetings with attorneys and accountants, but Robert had always handled the details. I trusted him completely. Now I realized how much thought he had put into safeguarding our future. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual. Vanessa hurried through the kitchen discussing furniture deliveries while Ethan prepared to leave for work. Neither noticed that I was quieter than normal. Neither noticed that I was paying closer attention. "The contractor is coming next week," Vanessa said while checking something on her phone. "I want him to look at the wall between the kitchen and dining room." Ethan nodded. "As long as the estimate is reasonable." Vanessa smiled confidently. "It will be worth it. This place has so much potential." Potential. Again that word. Not memories. Not history. Potential. After they left, I cleaned the kitchen and returned to the sewing room. This time I examined every document carefully. Hours passed. Most of the information was routine. Then I found a contact sheet attached to one of the trust files. At the top was a familiar name, Michael Reynolds, Robert's attorney. I had not spoken with Michael in more than a year. I looked at the number for several seconds before picking up my phone. When Michael answered, his voice sounded exactly as I remembered. Calm. Professional. Warm. After exchanging greetings, I explained that I had recently reviewed some of Robert's documents and wanted clarification. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Michael said something that immediately captured my full attention. "Helen, there are several details about that trust that most people in your family may not fully understand. In fact, I have been wondering when you might decide to take another look at it yourself." Michael and I arranged to meet 2 days later at his office downtown. I did not tell Ethan. I did not tell Vanessa. There was no reason to. The trust had existed long before either of them became involved in the day-to-day life of the house, and I wanted to understand everything before drawing conclusions. On the morning of the meeting, I drove through streets Robert and I had traveled together for decades. Familiar landmarks passed by the window, each carrying memories of a life that suddenly felt much closer than it had only a few weeks earlier. Michael greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room overlooking the city. A thick folder sat waiting on the polished table. After a few minutes of casual conversation, his expression became more serious. He opened the folder and slid several documents toward me. Robert was extremely thorough, he said. He believed that protecting assets was less important than protecting people. I looked down at the paperwork. Some of it was familiar. Much of it was not. Michael patiently explained how the trust operated, how funds were allocated, and how certain decisions required authorization that could not simply be assumed by family members. The more he explained, the more I understood why Robert had been so careful. Then Michael showed me a series of financial statements. I studied the numbers quietly. Several household expenses had been covered through trust distributions for years. Property taxes, major maintenance, insurance, long-term reserve accounts. None of it had happened by accident. Robert had built a system designed to keep the property secure far into the future. There is something else you should know, Michael said. He turned another page. The trust names you as the primary decision maker regarding the residence during your lifetime. I blinked. Primary decision maker? He nodded. Any significant modification, transfer, refinancing, or structural change ultimately requires your approval. For several seconds I simply stared at him. Images flashed through my mind. Vanessa discussing contractors. Vanessa choosing renovation plans. Vanessa deciding which rooms would become something else. Vanessa talking about future projects as if the decisions had already been made. Yet according to the documents in front of me, those decisions were not hers to make. Michael leaned back slightly. I am guessing from your reaction that someone may have been operating under different assumptions. I managed a small smile. That is one way of putting it. As the meeting continued, more details emerged. None of them were dramatic. There was no hidden fortune. No shocking inheritance. The reality was something much more powerful. Responsibility. Authority. Legal clarity. Robert had not built a trap for anyone. He had built protection for me. By the time I left the office, the late afternoon sun was beginning to settle across the city skyline. I felt strangely calm. Not victorious. Not angry. Simply informed. For the first time in months, uncertainty had been replaced with understanding. When I returned home, a delivery truck was parked in the driveway. Several large boxes sat near the front entrance. Inside, Vanessa was excitedly directing movers as they carried furniture into the living room. Perfect, she said. Put that one by the window. She turned and noticed me standing in the doorway. Oh good, you are back. I found a great deal on some pieces that will completely transform the room. I looked around. The space was already changing. Several items Robert and I had chosen together were gone. New pieces had appeared in their place. Ethan was not home yet. It was just Vanessa and me. She smiled confidently and continued describing her plans. Future purchases. Future renovations. Future improvements. I listened quietly. The difference was that now I understood something she did not. Every plan she described depended upon authority she had never actually been given. And as I stood there watching her enthusiastically redesign a future she believed was already hers, I realized that sooner or later we were both going to have a very important conversation. The conversation came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, I walked into the kitchen just before noon and found Vanessa sitting at the island with a contractor reviewing blueprints. Samples of countertop materials covered nearly half the surface. Cabinet catalogs were spread across the other half. Vanessa looked completely comfortable, as though she were hosting a meeting in a property she had owned for years. The contractor noticed me first and offered a polite greeting. Vanessa smiled. Perfect timing, Helen. We are discussing the kitchen renovation. I set my grocery bags on the counter and glanced at the plans. The proposed changes were extensive. Walls removed. Windows enlarged. Custom cabinetry. New flooring throughout the first floor. The estimated cost written near the bottom of one page made my eyebrows rise. It was a significant amount of money. It looks ambitious, I said calmly. Vanessa nodded enthusiastically. It is an investment. Once everything is finished, the house will finally reflect what we want for the future. The contractor shifted uncomfortably. I suspected he could sense tension he did not fully understand. Have permits been submitted? I asked. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with him. Not yet. We are still finalizing details. I nodded. And approval? Approval, she repeated. For the structural changes. Vanessa laughed lightly. Well, Ethan and I are discussing everything together. I looked at her for a moment. I see. Nothing more. I picked up my grocery bags and carried them into the pantry. Behind me, the conversation resumed, but something had changed. Vanessa's voice sounded slightly less confident than before. That evening Ethan arrived home later than usual. We ate dinner together, and for most of the meal the conversation remained ordinary. Work. Traffic. Weather. Then Vanessa brought up the renovation plans again. The contractor thinks we can begin by early summer. Ethan nodded. That would be great. I quietly folded my napkin. Did either of you check the requirements for authorization? Ethan looked confused. Vanessa immediately answered. Authorization from whom? I took a sip of water before responding. That depends on the project. A brief silence settled over the table. Ethan frowned. Mom, is there something you are trying to tell us? I could have explained everything right then. I could have pulled out documents, named legal structures, and ended the discussion in 5 minutes. Instead, I simply smiled. Not tonight. Vanessa forced a small laugh. You are being mysterious. Perhaps. The next week brought more surprises. Deliveries continued arriving at the house. New furniture. Decorative lighting. Area rugs. Vanessa seemed determined to transform every room as quickly as possible. One afternoon I watched her direct movers as they carried a large entertainment cabinet into the family room. The cabinet occupied the exact space where Robert's handcrafted bookcase had stood for nearly 20 years. The bookcase itself had been moved into storage without anyone mentioning it to me. I walked into the garage and found it pushed against the back wall beneath moving blankets. Dust already covered the shelves. I stood there for several seconds running my hand across the wood. Robert had built it himself during one snowy winter when Ethan was still in high school. Every shelf held a memory. Every scratch told part of our story. I was wondering where that ended up. The voice came from behind me. Ethan stood near the garage door. For the first time in months, he sounded uncertain. I looked at him. Did you know it was being moved? He hesitated. Not long. Just long enough. Not exactly. I nodded slowly. Ethan stared at the bookcase, then at me. Something in his expression reminded me of the boy he used to be before adulthood complicated everything. Mom, he said carefully, is there something I should know about all of this? I thought about Michael. I thought about Robert. I thought about the documents sitting safely inside my sewing room cabinet. Then I answered honestly. Yes, Ethan. There is. And very soon, all of us are going to sit down and talk about it. Over the next several days, an unusual calm settled over the house. On the surface, everything continued as normal. Vanessa discussed furniture deliveries. Ethan went to work each morning. Meals were shared around the same table. Yet beneath those ordinary routines, I could feel tension slowly building. Ethan's question in the garage had changed something. He had seen uncertainty in my eyes, and for perhaps the first time in months, he seemed willing to acknowledge that there might be facts he did not know. Late one afternoon, I was sitting on the back patio with a cup of tea when Ethan joined me. The spring air was cool, and the maple trees cast long shadows across the lawn. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then he finally broke the silence. "Mom, I have been thinking about what you said." I looked up from my cup. "About what?" "About there being something we all need to discuss." His voice was careful. Measured. "Is this about the house?" I considered the question. "Partly." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Vanessa thinks you are upset about the renovations." I smiled faintly. "Does she?" "She says you are having trouble adjusting to change." I looked across the yard where Robert had once spent entire weekends tending flower beds and repairing fences. Change was not something I feared. Life had taught me that much long ago. Children grew up. People moved away. Loved ones passed on. Entire chapters ended whether we were ready or not. The problem was never change. The problem was assumption. "Ethan," I said quietly, "have you ever asked yourself who has been paying for this house all these years?" He frowned. "Dad did." Then after he passed, I assumed everything transferred over. "Assumed?" He hesitated. "I guess so." I nodded. That single word seemed more important than anything else. Assumed. So many decisions had been built on assumptions. That evening, after Ethan went inside, I called Michael. We spoke for nearly half an hour. By the end of the conversation, a plan had been arranged. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. Simply a meeting. A conversation. An opportunity for everyone to understand the facts. The following weekend, Vanessa announced that she wanted to host a gathering at the house. Several friends would be coming over. A few neighbors. Some coworkers. She spent days preparing. New decorations appeared throughout the first floor. Fresh flowers filled vases. Decorative lighting was installed on the patio. By Saturday afternoon, the house looked like a showroom. Guests arrived carrying wine bottles, desserts, and gifts for the hosts. Hosts. I noticed how naturally Vanessa accepted that role. As people toured the rooms, she proudly pointed out future projects she intended to complete. The kitchen redesign. The expanded dining area. The upgraded primary suite. Several times I heard her refer to the property as their forever home. Each time I simply smiled and continued serving appetizers. At one point, a neighbor complimented the house. Vanessa beamed. "We have big plans for it." "We." The word floated through the room. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? From the outside, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, I noticed Ethan standing alone near the patio door. He looked uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Distracted. The confidence he once carried whenever Vanessa discussed the future seemed diminished. For the first time, he appeared to be questioning the story they had both been telling themselves. When the last guests finally left, the house grew quiet again. Vanessa was still energized from the event. She talked excitedly about future improvements while gathering empty glasses from the kitchen island. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and answered immediately. A few seconds later, her expression changed. "What meeting?" she asked. Ethan looked up. I remained silent. Vanessa listened for another moment. "Next Thursday?" Her eyes moved toward me. Slowly. Carefully. The color in her face faded ever so slightly. "Yes," she said into the phone. "We will be there." When the call ended, the room felt different. Vanessa lowered the phone. That was Michael Reynolds. Ethan immediately recognized the name. "Dad's attorney?" She nodded. Then she looked directly at me. "He wants all three of us present for a review of the trust documents." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, I set down my teacup and met her gaze. "Good," I said softly. "It is probably time." The days leading up to the meeting felt strangely quiet. Vanessa tried to act as though nothing had changed, but I noticed the difference immediately. Her confidence was no longer effortless. Every now and then I would catch her watching me when she thought I was not paying attention. Ethan became quieter too. More thoughtful. The certainty that had surrounded both of them for months seemed to be slowly unraveling. On Tuesday evening, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen island long after dinner. His laptop was open, but he was not working. He was staring at the screen without really seeing it. "Everything all right?" I asked. He looked up and forced a smile. "Just thinking." I nodded. "That can be dangerous." A faint laugh escaped him. For a moment, he looked like the young man Robert and I had raised. Then his expression grew serious again. "Mom, did Dad ever talk to you about the trust?" There it was. The question he had been circling for days. I took a seat across from him. "Some things. Not everything." Did he expect this meeting to happen someday? I thought carefully before answering. "Your father believed preparation was a form of love." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I am not sure I understood that when I was younger." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Vanessa entered the room carrying a folder. She stopped when she saw us talking. "I was actually looking for you," she said to Ethan. She placed the folder on the counter. Through the partially open cover, I could see renovation estimates, contractor agreements, and furniture invoices. Vanessa noticed where my eyes landed and quickly closed it. "Just planning documents," she said. "Nothing important." I smiled politely. "Of course." The following afternoon, another small moment caught my attention. A delivery service arrived with samples for the kitchen remodel. Large panels of flooring, cabinet finishes, and stone countertops were brought into the dining room. Vanessa spent nearly an hour arranging everything neatly across the table. Later, one of her friends stopped by unexpectedly. The two women stood admiring the samples while drinking coffee. I happened to be watering plants nearby when I overheard part of their conversation. "By this time next year," Vanessa said, "the entire place will finally be exactly how we want it." Her friend looked impressed. "That must feel exciting." Vanessa smiled. "It does. We are building something permanent." Permanent. The word settled heavily in my thoughts. Yet I said nothing. There was no need. Thursday morning arrived sooner than expected. The sky was clear and bright. Birds moved through the trees outside the front windows. Everything about the day appeared ordinary. Vanessa dressed more formally than usual. Ethan seemed distracted. I could sense nervous energy beneath the surface of both of them. The drive to Michael's office passed mostly in silence. Vanessa occasionally checked her phone. Ethan stared out the window. I watched the city approach and thought about Robert. About the countless decisions he had made not for himself, but for the people he loved. When we finally entered the building, Michael greeted us warmly and escorted us toward the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see a large table already prepared with folders and documents. Vanessa's eyes immediately focused on the paperwork. Ethan looked equally concerned. Michael waited until everyone was seated before taking his place at the head of the table. Then he folded his hands and offered a calm smile. "Thank you all for coming," he said. I believe today will clear up several misunderstandings that have been developing for quite some time." As those words settled over the room, I noticed Vanessa straighten slightly in her chair. For the first time since she had moved into the house, she looked uncertain. And deep down, I knew that by the time this meeting ended, nothing would ever look quite the same again. The room remained quiet after Michael spoke. No one reached for the documents immediately. No one seemed eager to discover what was inside them. Michael, however, appeared completely comfortable with the silence. He opened the first folder and began reviewing the trust structure in the calm, methodical way attorneys often do. At first, the information sounded routine. Dates. Signatures. Amendments. Financial arrangements. Vanessa listened patiently, although I could see confusion beginning to replace confidence. Ethan paid close attention to every page. Several times he leaned forward to read sections more carefully. Then Michael turned to a document near the center of the stack. "This provision is particularly important," he said. Robert wanted to ensure the long-term preservation of the residence and related assets. Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair. "Related assets?" Michael nodded. The residence was never intended to operate independently. It exists as part of a broader trust structure. He slid a copy across the table. Ethan studied it first. His eyes moved slowly down the page. Then he looked up. "I do not understand." Michael folded his hands. "The property taxes, major maintenance projects, insurance premiums, reserve funding, and several long-term improvements have been supported through trust-managed accounts for years." Vanessa blinked. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Michael replied gently, "that many expenses associated with the property have not been funded in the way most people assume." The room became very still. Vanessa glanced toward Ethan. Ethan looked back at the documents. Michael continued. "Robert established these arrangements specifically to protect Helen and preserve flexibility for future generations." Vanessa's expression tightened. "So the trust owns the house?" Michael shook his head. "The answer is more nuanced than that. What matters today is authority." He opened another file. "During Helen's lifetime, all significant decisions regarding structural modifications, refinancing, transfers, or major alterations require her approval." No one spoke. Vanessa stared at him. Ethan stared at the documents. I simply listened. For months I had watched plans develop around me as though my role had already been reduced to an afterthought. Now the facts were speaking for themselves. Michael continued reviewing additional pages. Each clarification seemed to remove another assumption. Renovation approvals. Financial oversight. Long-term management authority. None of it belonged where Vanessa believed it belonged. Yet there was no dramatic reveal. No hidden fortune. No shocking inheritance. Just reality. Clear and carefully documented. Eventually Ethan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Dad never told me any of this." Michael nodded. He hoped these arrangements would never become a source of conflict. He trusted that everyone involved would communicate openly if important decisions needed to be made. Vanessa lowered her eyes to the table. For the first time since she moved into the house, she seemed uncertain about what to say next. The confidence that had filled every room during the past 6 months was gone. Not because anyone had attacked her. Not because anyone had embarrassed her. It disappeared because assumptions rarely survive contact with facts. Michael then reached for the final folder. "There is one more item Robert specifically asked me to review if circumstances ever made it necessary." Ethan looked up immediately. Vanessa did the same. I already knew which document he was holding. I had seen it during my earlier review, but I had not discussed it with anyone. Michael carefully opened the folder and placed a single page on the table. This statement summarizes Robert's intentions in his own words. The room fell silent again as he prepared to read. And in that moment, I realized that everything we had discussed so far was only the foundation. The most important part of Robert's plan had not even been revealed yet. Michael adjusted his glasses and began reading from the page Robert had written years earlier. His voice was calm, but every word seemed to fill the room. If this letter is being read, it means circumstances have made clarification necessary. I created these arrangements because a home is more than a financial asset. It is the place where a family learns respect, gratitude, and responsibility. I never wanted Helen to feel like a guest in the house we built together. During her lifetime, she is not only protected here. She is the person entrusted with deciding its future. The room remained silent. Michael continued. Any family member who lives in the residence should do so with the understanding that occupancy is a privilege built on mutual respect, not an entitlement. Ethan lowered his eyes. Vanessa sat perfectly still. For the first time since the meeting began, neither of them seemed focused on documents or legal details. They were listening to Robert. Michael finished reading and carefully set the page on the table. Nobody spoke immediately. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I think I understand now. His voice was quieter than I had heard in months. He turned toward me. Mom, I should have asked more questions. I should have paid more attention. I looked at him and saw genuine regret. Not because of money. Not because of authority. Because he was beginning to recognize how far he had drifted from the values his father had tried to teach him. Vanessa stared at the table for several seconds before speaking. I never knew any of this. Michael nodded. That much is obvious. She looked toward me. I thought. Her voice trailed off. For perhaps the first time since she entered my life, she seemed unsure of herself. I thought we were helping shape the future. I considered her words carefully. Planning for the future is not the problem, Vanessa. She looked up. Then what is? I folded my hands. You started making decisions without understanding the foundation those decisions were built upon. You treated a family home like a project before taking the time to understand its history. The room grew quiet again. There was no anger in my voice. There did not need to be. The truth was already doing the work. After another long pause, Vanessa nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No dramatic arguments followed. No ultimatums were given. Nobody was asked to leave. As we walked back to the parking garage, Ethan remained unusually thoughtful. During the drive home, he apologized several more times. Not because I demanded it, but because he wanted to. Over the following weeks, small changes began appearing throughout the house. Not renovations. Relationships. The contractor plans quietly disappeared from the kitchen counter. Discussions about major projects stopped. More importantly, conversations started. Real conversations. Ethan began joining me for coffee in the mornings. Vanessa asked questions about the house instead of making announcements about it. One Saturday afternoon she even helped me return Robert's bookcase to its original place in the family room. As we stepped back to admire it, she smiled awkwardly. It looks better here. I smiled too. I always thought so. Months later, I found myself sitting on the back patio watching the evening sunlight stretch across the yard. The house looked exactly as it should. Not frozen in the past. Not transformed into someone else's vision. Simply respected. Ethan stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me before taking a seat nearby. For a while we sat quietly, listening to the wind move through the trees. Finally he spoke. Dad was right about something. I glanced at him. Only one thing? He laughed. Fair point. Then his expression softened. The house was never really the important part. I looked toward the windows glowing with warm light. No. It never was. The real lesson had nothing to do with ownership, trust documents, or authority. It was something far simpler. A family can only build a future together when it remembers who helped build the foundation. And sometimes the strongest response is not taking something back. It is simply reminding people that it was never theirs to overlook in the first place.